Dr. Brown, Sam, welcome to Inside Reproductive Health.
Thanks, Griffin. Glad to be here.
We're going to talk today about your group, which is Brown Fertility, and what it is like to be an independent practice in 2021, what the future for independent groups are, what you see as the advantages and then maybe some disadvantages too. We'll explore that. But give us some background of how you started your own group. How did you come to make that decision?
That's a great question, Griffin. Coming out of the Jones Institute in Norfolk, Virginia, very institutionalized Johns Hopkins-based setup where they had the first IVF baby in the nation. I joined a large group, an independent group, and was very fortunate to have high volume, do a lot of this for many years. And I saw doctors come and go from our group and seeing how the stressors that a large independent practice had. And then I departed and joined another group, a large group that was part of IntegraMed, that was owned by a company basically. And even though the doctors did have some flexibility, I was able to be exposed. I worked in that for 3 years or 4 years or so. And then I broke free and started my own independent practice. So I do have experience on both sides of the stick, and there's definitely pros and cons to both, no doubt about it.
Well, it sounds like you've got experience in multiple facets, and I keep finding myself having to make the distinction, even though I've made the distinction 1,000 times and I've even done it in writing. I still need to go back and correct myself every time I talk about private practice versus academic practice. Let's say that within private practice, we now have independently owned private practice, and then we have network affiliated private practice.
Exactly, you're right. There's a third group. There's actually 4 groups. There's your equity firm or large corporation owned fertility practice. There's your independent practices, but you're right. There's fully academic physicians that are in part of academia, and there's academic physicians that are kind of a quasi between academia and independent practices. So there's really 4 different ways to go, to be honest. You're exactly right.
That's true. You can split academics. We talked about that on the show with Dr. Eric Foreman and Dr. Michael Alper, I believe. So we've still got the private side and the academic side, but you can split each of those 2 ways. And it sounds like you have practice with academic, with independently owned private, and with the larger equity network. Am I categorizing that correctly?
Yes, I've kind of experienced all 4 of them.
So at one point you decide, okay, of the 4 that I've experienced, this is the one that I want. Why not the other 3? What led you to choose the 4th?
Yeah. And, just from my own experience, not speaking for others, what I was pretty happy coming out of fellowship, joining a large non-academic individual self-sustaining practice. I enjoyed that. It was like a second fellowship and this independent practice where they kind of did their own thing. And there's some facets in those practice you liked that were because you were used to them in academia and to some degree, and others you didn't. Like wow, that's kind of weird. Is that just money driven type weird things that they make you do, and or the culture of that practice? And but I enjoyed it. There was collegiality. There was it's like a second fellowship. When you first come out of training. So the independent practice, they have more control and generally they make a little more money, than a lot of the other practices. And then when I went back, then when I changed, I needed, for me, it wasn't about money. It was more autonomy. And joining a large institutional practice, it was less money and less autonomy. So I was still okay with that. I didn't mind making money for the man. I didn't mind that at all. I just wanted to be comfortable and have a sense of security. So I didn't mind working hard for others, per se. And I was actually okay with that. I could go home and could sleep a little better. And there was good in that. It made a decent income. I wasn't shooting for the stars. I just wanted a good income. And then it became a little bit of a pressure, where we went through a phase where males versus female doctors, there was a pressure there where male physicians felt a little more threatened, that the owners of practices would kind of threaten you, like, hey, your job's not so secure here. We're going to replace you with a younger female, more vibrant female. So you felt a sense of insecurity And I think we've gone through that phase. I don't think that phase is still there, but that was a phase where you need a sense of security to go with, making a living. And then ultimately, and I didn't mind working on protocols that if I worked for other people or other institutions, if they have protocols that didn't quite jive with my feelings, I was okay with that, because there's multiple ways to do things. There's not one way to do things. I came to that realization. And for me, then starting my own practice independently, it was all different altogether as well. It was you definitely don't have collegiality. You don't have people to lean on when you have those stressful moments, which we all have, and it's a little difficult. But you normally reach out, to your friends at other centers for advice, but starting out on independently is a little bit tough, and the business side does bite. Then you start realizing just, man, the business side is a lot more than I thought. There's contracts that have to be signed. There's staff that's got to be fed. The pressures. There's good times and there's bad times. And whoa, when you're an owner of a practice, all of a sudden the practice of medicine becomes easy, and dealing with your staff becomes a nightmare, or is a very, very difficult challenge. And then becoming a larger independent group with multiple physicians makes it somewhat better. But fighting the daily business battles is a challenge. There's a little more financial reward. There's always the argument: is that financial reward worth it? Is it better to just be in a group and not deal with the aggravations of running a business? And there's always that argument.
And it could be that it could be a draw with the financial side of the reward. I know owners of independent practices that do a lot better than they would in a group, and I know some that do considerably worse than they would do in a group. And so
not all doctors are built for it. It definitely takes a certain personality, because it's strange, as physicians, I think, but in general, physicians and nurses, we're pleasers. I think part of our personality subset is that we're pleasers. And man, when you're in the setting of being a business administrator, it's a different hat, where it's not a good place to be a pleaser. And you're right, I've seen physicians who have that strong pleasing mentality not do well running a business. It definitely takes it took me a lot of change and development, because I was that typical physician that just wanted to be a pleaser. And man, being in management, that doesn't work so well.
What are some examples that can you think of some examples off the top of your head of where you had to calibrate your personality? I'm used to catering people when I'm talking to patients, but now I've got to make some decisions. Can you think of some examples that come to your head?
Two come to mind. Just, I'm not sure if this answers the question completely, but number one is staff. When staff comes to you and every year they want a raise, and as a pleaser, you just give them what they want. And then after a while, you realize this is going to bankrupt the business.
Yeah.
And you have to have a systematic, regulated way to give raises to staff and physicians. Because every year they come at you, hey, where's my raise? And we're like, hey, it was a bad year, you can't have it. Then they quit. So learning how do you keep staff, without pleasing them this way, especially financially. And the other way is like corrections. When they make mistakes, we all make mistakes. Doctors and staff, we all make mistakes. That's part of life. And learning to not so much be a pleaser and say, oh, it's okay, and actually writing them up and reprimanding and educating to a level where they're not so angry that they quit is also very much a challenge. That was one of the bigger challenges for me, is learning how to correct staff or educate staff. Onboarding of staff, very challenging.
All of those could be tied to well, they can all be linked together, I suppose, those different challenges having to do with personnel and how you evaluate their performance, particularly as related to compensation, like you brought up. Have you come up with that system for giving raises, or are you still working on it?
It's a work in progress for sure. And I'll try to model. I've learned, for me, my answer is I've tried to default. Like I've seen how hospitals do it, and I hire business level people who have experience in business. But most of the time we'll model ourselves after a hospital system that's usually effective. Like for me, I think where I'm at locally, the Mayo Clinic's a very effective model, and learning how they do basic business practice of raises and corrections, and their model's good. And most hospitals have a good model set in place, a little better than a smaller practice would have typically.
I'll give the listeners some other model to consider too. And have you ever heard of open book management or read The Great Game of Business?
I have not.
So I want to also clarify to the listeners, look, we're a marketing and business development firm. We're business development and marketing advisors. We're not human resources advisors. I'm just sharing my perspective as a business owner of what we're going through. And I also haven't cracked this nut either, Sam. I'm still working on it myself to have that system. But what I did decide that I want it to do is I want it to be related to the performance of the overall company. And the ethos of open book management and Great Game of Business is that everyone in the company either meets their goal and gets bonused, or they don't. Now that doesn't totally address the schema of individual raises, but it could for some time if this keeps coming up for people. And the premise is that the group is educated on how to share their books and what to share. Essentially, you're sharing the big numbers. You're not sharing individual salaries in almost every case. I've never heard of anyone sharing individual salaries. I think that would be a really bad idea. But they do share, hey, this is our payroll expense, this is our office expense, this is what we pay for toilet paper, and here, this is the revenue coming in. And then there's a bottom line percentage, which is nobody gets bonused on. And if we do less than this, nobody gets bonused. And then if we do more than this, then everybody gets a percentage of their salary. So we're working on implementing that now. I don't want to consult anyone on it because we're still figuring it out and doing it, but it's something for people to look into if they're interested. And I'll be able to give people a much better report this time next year.
And just to further that, you've touched on something that's very important in my mind in running a business. And just as an experience that I've had that may help the listeners is my administrator. I have a really good administrator. He's an MBA. And when he came into practice, he saw that we were doing some unhealthy practices where when I started, my goal as a naive business owner, when I came into the practice was, man, everyone's got an incentive plan. Everyone has a plan where if they hit a certain marker above that, they get bonus, blah, blah, blah. And from every level in the practice, from those answering phones to the nurses, to the medical assistants, the doctors, that everyone had an incentive planning. And he educated me. There's a book out there called, give me one second, Charity. It's Poison Charity. Let me ask him around the corner. It's
if you think of it later too, we can drop it in the show notes.
Toxic Charity. Here he is. So he educated me about a book called Toxic Charity, where from the experience of treating people in Africa. Thank you, Jules. From giving charity to those in need in Africa, where it can become poisonous. And the 6 principles they mention are with toxic charities: you give once and you create an appreciation. If you give twice, you create anticipation. If you give 3 times, you create expectation. If you give 4 times, you create entitlement. And if you give 5 times, then you create dependency. So thanks, Julie. So what we have learned is that it's really challenging. You want to be giving, you want to be generous, but it's human nature that you start expecting these things. And then when you don't have this expectation, they're very upset and they'll quit. So it's very much a challenge on how you are generous with your staff. And I'm like you, it's a work in progress. Every year, can I find a better system, and how can I be generous but yet not sink the battleship, and also not create a dependency on such a payment?
So to clarify, with open book management, there is a basement number for the whole company that it is net profit. So if it's under a certain net profit amount, then it's very clear we aren't getting the bonus. I don't care if we're a quarter percentage point and everyone but one person pulled their weight enough for us to get there. We don't get there. And so that's why I chose that system, because you're absolutely right. And what you just described in those 5 different steps between appreciation and dependence is why I don't do Christmas bonus. And it's not because I want to be a jerk at the holidays. I do like bonusing my people. I just do it in different ways at times that aren't expected, because I don't want to create the expectation, or otherwise, to your point, it's not a bonus anymore.
And I think this is important in running a practice. I think this is a very important concept. I agree with you.
So this was one of the challenges that you find in managing personnel, evaluating them, particularly with regard to compensation, and then implementing that plan of, when it's connected to financials, of how they're actually paid. And you said running a business was harder than I thought it was going to be. Do you remember what you thought it was going to? Was it just something vague, or how did you think it was going to be when you first made the decision?
Well, when I made the decision to start my own practice, I never really wanted to run my own practice. I really had no lengthy education or pre-concept going into it. For me, it was kind of just forced into the next phase of my life to do this, and I went into it pretty ignorant. But I felt comfort that I would hire the right people to help me, and and that did help. Hiring people with experience, hiring people that you can trust, helped. But yeah, it was very. And looking backwards, ignorance was kind of bliss. Going into it and just having at it, and we've grown to a big entity. We're now the largest or second largest in Florida, where it was just 10 years ago we were very, very small. We started this in a bad economic time, and it's more of looking backwards. And yeah, it was. I had faith and courage and went into this, and it's worked out, but not without hard work.
Did you think that the concept of hiring people and hiring good people would be it? That was, I'll hire the good people, they'll do the stuff, and then I won't have to worry about it. Was that in your periphery?
That was the mindset, except I knew that I didn't want to be detached. I knew that even though I'm not educated in business, that I did not want to be ignorant. So for me, I did something unique. I didn't want to say, oh, just let's hire the smart people that can do all the business and I'll stay detached as a physician. I knew that I had to keep my feet into it. I actually learned that because I owned a restaurant in the past. And I learned that if you weren't a part of the process, wow, it could really fall apart.
When did you own a restaurant?
Yeah, years ago. It's a good story. My brother is a classically trained French chef. And after years and years of working at the best restaurants in Potomac, Maryland, and other places, he went back to school and became a lawyer. It broke my heart. My chef brother became a lawyer, and I thought the good food would be gone. And then years after practice, he happens to be practicing law in the same town that I live in. And he called me and said, "Hey, Mr. Doctor, are you ready to open your restaurant?" And I was like, "Yes, let's do this. I'm ready for my."
But you're a physician at this point.
I'm a physician.
Are you already in REI? You've already subspecialized?
And he was looking at me as Mr. Moneybags, that I could financially support this restaurant. And so we start. So he looks at me and he says, "Hey, I said, okay, where are we going to start our French restaurant?" And he said, "We're not doing French, we're doing barbecue." I'm like, "You got to be kidding. A French chef with barbecue?" And he was right. In culinary school, they teach them the need for that community. And this, where he was looking to start the restaurant, there was a real need for barbecue. And that was a tradition in that community. And that was a heck of an experience for me. It was really my first touch in business ever. Seeing how business was run truly from the from the working business part of it. And wow, that restaurant industry, a lot of doctors go there. And it's a rough one. It's a tough one. it's a whole different conversation. But your hires, your management, it's similar to managing medicine, but different. It's a different animal. And a lot of doctors go into that with like an ego or a pride, like they want their restaurant, and many of them leave licking their wounds. And for us, it went very, very well, and ultimately life changes, and we couldn't manage it, so we sold it and did well with it. But it was a heck of an experience for me business-wise. Absolutely.
So you left this experience knowing that you were going to be more involved in the next
Yes,
business venture.
yes, my bad. And that's where we left. So when I started my practice, my goal was to be more involved, like you said. And so I actually did my own billing and collections. This was back in the paper chart method before we went to electronic medical records. And I actually did my own billing and collection. I learned how to do it in the computer and how to submit codes and fees, and then how to the 30, 60, 90-day collection method. So I learned to do the billing all by myself. And then I started hiring staff to do that for me that had experience. And because I didn't want to be bamboozled, I wanted to know every facet to some degree, even if it was a little degree. And I think that it gave me a lot of great experience, arguing with insurance companies over their contracts, and arguing with insurance companies to get fair reimbursement for something you actually did. The checks and balances involved. It was very educational and insightful for me. I'm glad I had that experience.
And it gives more context for managing people and being able to hear their reports afterwards when you have context from your own personal experience.
Absolutely.
From having done it. You mentioned Julius Farzoni, who's your business manager, and I'm acquainted with Julius, and you mentioned that he's an MBA, and I know that because I'm acquainted with him, I know that he has more business experience than a lot of people in that position. Did you start off with a business manager? Did you have an office manager? What was the beginning structure like?
No, I was the beginning manager. I was the beginning administrator, and hired billing staff and clinical staff myself. I was the one doing it. Yeah.
What was that experience like?
Um, I was fortunate where I had good hires. I had people that had experience in the industry, and I had trust with them, and it was actually it wasn't that bad. Even though I didn't do the day-to-day as much, I did have a touch with the day-to-day that they did. I felt like I could communicate well with them, and when we were a small entity, that was easy. When there was 10 of us or 12 of us, but then once you get up to 50 of us, you definitely more than 20 of us, then you definitely needed some help with management for sure.
So it was just you and staff, no office manager between
Correct.
you at that time in
Correct.
the beginning. And so when did you bring on management? Was it at that 20
It's
mark?
really, we reached a level where I brought in management when our critical staff numbers got up to, to 20-ish, probably above 20. Then I definitely needed assistance in management.
And what was that structure like? Was that person an office manager, a practice administrator, a business manager?
Yeah, it was people. Initially, it was like it was a nurse who went back and got her MBA. So I hired an MBA with clinical background, and then as we grew bigger and bigger, you hired purely business paid, business educated staff that weren't clinically related.
Do you have experience on talking about the difference in those levels of administration and management? And what I'm alluding to, Sam, is that when I see people, often they have, let's say, an office manager, and they think that that's a business manager, and it's not the same thing. And it might not be the same thing as a practice administrator either. I believe that there are different levels, and people, oh yeah, I've got somebody doing that, and that person is just doing everything that's not in their purview. So can you describe the different structures that you played with?
I think what I learned is I didn't want the mom and pop situation. You had the physician who has his wife running the practice, who has no experience in business or management. And I'd seen that, been exposed to that setup in my prior work experience. And it was very non-sophisticated, very emotional. very subjective, not objective. And, I'm going to hire who I like and who I don't like, So I'm glad I never fell into that trap. And I believed in talent, find the talent, hire the talent and not so much the mom and pop setup. And, so hiring non-medical people to come in to learn medicine or clinical things for the first time as part of their business management, um, it was a good thing to do. I think it was the right thing to do for at least for my structure. And it does take a while. It's for non-clinical people. It takes them a year or two to really get it. The flow of the clinical flow and how that pertains to the business, financial accountability, and holding managers responsible and accountable. Became more of a challenge, but it works, and much better than I could do as an individual or as a mom and pop setup. And hiring talent people with education that can do these things. But it does take an educational phase. It takes them a few years to really understand the concept, especially clinically, especially with infertility. This is kind of a subspecialty. It's not so easy and generalizable like I would guess an OBGYN practice or a family practice.
It's extraordinarily complicated. There's not just one or a handful of stock units that you're selling between all of the different billing, all of the different insurance companies, now employer groups, and all of the different services from ovulation induction to IVF to multi-cycle packages and all the financial people that come into play, and all of the steps on the journey of the patient journey that can expedite or delay that. It's almost a bottomless pit. And so it sounds like you've certainly had experience training some of the business folks to now be a part of the practice where they have not clinical experience, but at least that clinical operations in their purview.
Yes.
Is it easier to get business folks caught up on clinic operations or clinical folks in business acumen?
It's a good question. And I guess it depends on the individual. You have some people that have the aptitude and the intelligence and energy from either direction, from the business side looking at clinically or the clinical side looking into the business side. It really is very individual. And I've had experience with both. Going from clinical to business is a little easier, I think, but it comes with baggage. For example, that nurse that went back to school and became an administrator, she understood clinical really well, but she was also a nurse. She was a pleaser. She had those basic personality sets that are not so good on a business side of things, where I prefer the other. I'd rather have, at the level I'm at now, I'd rather have somebody coming in from the business side learning clinical. It takes a while, it takes a long time. It's not a quick learn. But I prefer that angle than I do from the clinical end.
I want to make a comment about the reason why you chose that. You didn't want to just have the mom and pop where it's someone's spouse running one facet of the business. And I have to comment, I see that beyond the mom and pops. I'm seeing that with some of these networks now, particularly some of the ones that are starting. It's like that's someone's spouse that's in that seat. And I don't know if that's a good idea.
I mean, I don't know enough of it to judge, but I assume there's good and bad in that. It just depends on the individual, I suppose. But I haven't seen many mom and pops get very big.
So. I really have to believe in someone's ability for me to have, at least in my own my own company, for them to be able to fire anyone. And
right.
I don't say that easily. I don't like firing people. It's we're going in a direction as an organization, and I've done a really good job in vetting to where it hasn't happened too much, but it does happen. It's part of business. And I think that when you have a spouse or a sibling or anything else involved, that it makes it really difficult to, that just adds something else that person has to consider before they can make that business decision.
I agree.
And I had my brother as the producer of this podcast when we first started, and he was late twice on deadlines, and I fired him in front of everybody just to set an example.
Awesome.
My own
That's strong.
brother no longer produces this podcast.
That's strong. That's very hard.
Oh, well, and so
There's
that
emotion with that.
there is some emotion, and it's one thing when it's an hourly audio engineering position. I think it's another thing when it's someone that owns equity in a group that has a management role. I think that's all the more
Absolutely.
difficult. And so it's a little bit of an aside, but it sounds like we both feel the same way about that. You talked when you were making this decision in the first place to go this route of the independently owned practice as opposed to the three of the other four channels. When you were in a larger network group, you felt like it's like, well, there's less money in this arrangement and there's less autonomy. So what is the benefit for someone in a larger network group if there's sometimes less money and there's almost
You know,
certainly less autonomy?
I think it's a good question. I think being a member of a large network, there's security. You're less likely to have patient flow interrupted, I suppose. So I think there's more job security. They're this bigger entity with extra staff, extra personnel are constantly working on things that you can't touch on a weekly or daily basis on contracts or knowing what's going on. So I think there's probably some security in a larger group of longevity, maybe, um, at least for the managing partner. Uh, and there's probably, they would always sell those situations saying that, oh, we're going to have you better educated. We're going to have podcasts or seminars amongst our own people and keep everybody more educated than you would if you were a smaller entity. I'm not sure if I quite believe that. I actually don't believe that from the entities that I've seen. I haven't seen that to be true. Where, being part of a bigger network, you have more ability to interact with, as a clinician, as a physician, with others that somehow make you a better doctor or a better group. I have yet to see that on the level of our reproductive endocrinology and infertility or OBGYN.
How do you make up for that? As now you have colleagues that work with you in your group, but you didn't in the beginning, and so how do you make up for that when you don't?
Independently, I think we do have a little more interaction, and if we go to conferences, there is more sharing. When you're in a large group, I think it gets a little more selfish, where you're not as sharing or team bound or team bound together. So I think actually, from my experience, I've actually learned more from my colleagues in an independent setting than I have in a group setting.
I will say that I do see at least some level of where, and I'm not speaking to the clinical side, so I don't want this to be taken the wrong way. I think there's lots of people throughout the field that share with their colleagues, particularly on the clinical side. But I can say, at least on the business side, that there are so many people that are a part of larger groups that have sold equity, and they can't talk about anything, Sam.
It's
They can't
hands of
say,
time.
they can't go to peer meetings that I've hosted. They can't, jump on a Zoom call to talk about stuff. Sometimes they can't even come on the podcast. And I am not here to promote one or the other. I think there's pros and cons for independent. I think there's pros and cons for being part of equity. That's just one that I would consider. And I know for myself that I don't ever want somebody to tell me what podcast I can and
Yeah.
can't go on, and what I can and can't talk about. I know there's plenty of NDAs and plenty of things that people could sign, even if they are independent, that would bind them to a similar arrangement. Um, but that's
I could
where I
definitely
do
see
see
that.
that.
I could definitely see that, where they're a little more controlling. The larger group's a little more controlling with any information coming from that group. Yeah.
So I think one advantage, though, so at risk of running networks through the mud, because I do have many associates that work at those networks, and I feel very good about those people. At risk of disparaging them, I will give the plug that I think that a lot of the things that you talked about are things that a lot of physicians don't want to learn and don't have any business learning with regard to human resources, compensation, billing structure, uh, location purchases, location expansion. And I think that is much better left to a front office group or those physicians that are a good part of the group, and it's a great opportunity for some people to buy in sometimes and not have to do any of that stuff. And you sort of alluded to that when you were talking about the personality type. So what do you think, what personality type is required to to not just be successful at going off on one's own, but to actually enjoy it?
You know, it's a good question, and I think it's important. My administrator, Julius, has made that very clear to me, and we've brought in consultants to do personality testing and to educate our staff on, not only for interactions between staff, but also staff to patient. And I'm really seeing, I really believe that that's important. And I'm not an expert at it yet. I see the utility in it, and I think it's something that I have missed for years. But there are different personalities. There's like 4 different subsets of personalities, at least from the one genre that we buy into with our consultant. There's 4 different personality styles, and there's variations of that, and how to interact with the different personality styles, and who's good at management, who would not be good at management. We hope to do this with our hires more so, and we have been, and we've had good management along this way. And I'm seeing the power in that. I'm a believer. I think I think it's something that we're new at, and I think it is powerful, and I think it's going to bring good things.
Do you remember which personality test service you use at Myers-Briggs or Colby or DISC?
I think it's DISC is what we're using. Yeah.
I I played around with each of those for a while. I don't really believe this is my personal experience, that I don't believe it matters which one you choose as long as you understand it and you're using it as the source of truth for the whole organization by basis of comparison.
I believe that.
So,
I believe
but I think that's a great piece of advice for the younger associates listening and for the fellows, that when you're thinking about what you want to do, take one of those tests. Just I don't care if it's DISC, I don't care if it's Myers-Briggs, maybe not StrengthsFinder, but even then, any one of those tests, you could take it and it will give you a little bit better insight as to what you might be suited for. So I think
for physicians, most of us are exposed to it. I remember in medical school, most of us had to go through a Myers-Briggs, and we all kind of laughed about it. We all thought it was kind of silly, and it's kind of giving you a label, and it wasn't well accepted. It just kind of, I don't know. You didn't want people judging you, I suppose. I don't know. But I can remember med school having that, and really giving it everyone gave it zero energy or thought. And I've come around completely the other way. I've been made to believe that I really think there's a lot of strength and power in that.
I think that's a great idea for those considering the next phase of their career. And speaking of next phases of career, I'm not a private equity guy, but I know the optics of a group like yours. You're one of the largest in a very large state, in a non-mandated state, in a state that's growing, in cities that are growing. You got colleagues and you got a good structure. I know that you're getting the calls and you haven't taken them yet, apparently. Why not?
It's a good question. We've been approached. I think in the last 5-8 years, the economy's been doing well, and there's a lot of money on the sidelines. A lot of equity firms. It's really a process where a lot of medical practices are getting evaluated and being shopped, and we've been exposed from a few, and I think it's worked well. I think it's worked fairly well, I'm guessing, on the OBGYN level. It's a larger system, OBGYN networks. On this subspecialty level, with reproductive endocrinology and fertility, there's been a few, like Shady Grove and a few others out of the West Coast. And at least the East Coast system kind of faltered and kind of fell apart. They're trying to reorganize. And I don't know so much about the Western groups, but it doesn't seem to be mainstream yet. At least it's throughout the United States. I have plenty of. It's a very small world in reproductive endocrinology and infertility, and I'd say the minority of us are in these large groups. I think it's a little bit of a challenge in that what we do is very specific. And it takes one of the challenges for us is it takes a lot of money to operate. I think you'd be challenged to find an entity that costs as much money to run before profits made. And that's why this doesn't work well in academia. And I'm going to segue into that a little bit. Let me give you the example of a university infertility program. Well, you have a chairman, business-wise, you have a chairman, a clinical person that's an OBGYN doctor, that's the chairman of their department, and they have infertility as one of their subspecialties they have to pay for. They also have maternal fetal medicine, GYN oncology, and generalists. And your generalist, to run them, it may cost $2 to make $1. And for GYN oncology, it might be you have to make $3 to make $1 in profit. But in infertility, you got to generate probably $8 to make $1. So it costs a lot. It's a lot of revenue to make some profit. And generally speaking, the chairman who determines the allotment of money is a generalist that doesn't quite understand, why do we need that much money to run this operation? Why do we need that embryologist that costs $200,000 a year, or all these extra nurses that the infertility doctors need where the other specialties don't? So it usually fails. So then that chairman who needs to allocate resources to that department, they won't do it. So then infertility practices in academia fail typically because of this. And they won't get them the new incubator, or a few more new ultrasound machines, or the extra 2 nurses they need, or the extra embryologists they need to grow that program. So there's too many chiefs and that don't have the same buy-in. And so that's why in academia, reproductive endocrinology and fertility usually fails. Where now the same problem is with the equity firms. Hey, they're there to make a buck. They need to make $1. They got to show their shareholders that they've made some profit off this purchase. And man, again, it takes a lot of resources to make that buck. I think that's why it hasn't become so widespread as it is with general practices like a pain management practice or a OBGYN practice. We're a pretty complex animal to manage. And I think it is coming. I think there, as long as the economy keeps rolling and there's a lot of money out there where practices can be bought, I think more and more will buy into this concept. But I think it's because we're complicated. And I'm not saying that from an egotistical way. I really, really genuinely believe that we are one of the more complicated areas of medicine that there is.
It seems to be that way from my perspective. That's why I'm constantly viewing. So I'm assuming that we're talking about net profitability. If we're talking about $1 to $8, and we're talking about 12.5% net profitability.
Exactly. Net profit.
And so I think someone looks at that and they think, well, damn, Dr. Brown, that's why I don't want to start my own group, because I would rather let somebody else worry about that. Just take my salary, and maybe I can do much better than that. And I can leverage systems, I can leverage people, and we can build an economy of scale where we can do much better than that. But maybe I can't. That's not a big margin for me to start with. And so what do you view as the future of independent REI practice?
I think it will always exist. I think there'll always be larger and smaller practices. Just the nature of our patient, the nature of people who use us, our consumers, it's an interesting consumer. It's a very different consumer. It's very emotional. If a patient doesn't have success at one organization, we call them ping pongers. They'll go from one office to the next office, and good God, they don't have success on their first try somewhere else. They're going to the third place. Our patients, unlike any other area of medicine, our patients jump from facility to facility. So there'll always be opportunity for more practices, small independent practices, larger practices. I don't see looking into the future, I don't have a good gander. I think it's going to stay the way it is for a while. For at least I would guess for the next decade, that there'll still be 30% equity-owned practices and 70% independent, or 50% independent and 20% academic. I think I'd be surprised. It'll be interesting that when we hit the 50% mark, that 50% of practices are owned by equity firms. That'll be interesting for me to even forecast. But I don't see that in the next 10 years, or maybe even 20 years.
Is there any reason you don't see it besides the profitability dynamic that we talked about?
Um, I don't, from what I gather, the profitability is just not, for the amount of expense, the profitability is not that great to be attractive for the equity firms to want to buy us. Like a pain management practice, it doesn't take a lot of resources. They're paying them large monies to buy their practice. These equity firms are buying them and paying a lot of money. For example, I know an independent pain management physician who sold his practice. He and another controlling partner, they made about $14 million, and they're still employed there, and they do very well. But the reimbursement's wonderful for their services, and their overhead cost is in my mind not so bad. We're the opposite. I think we got, so if, again, you got to spend $10 or $2 to make a net of one, where you have to spend $8 in our industry to make a net profit of $1. They don't, the large firms, they see that, they're smart, they see how complicated it is, and they're not that interested in most of them in working that.
I wonder, Sam. I see what you're saying, and I don't disagree. It could be that case, but I also see that same dynamic being used to say, you know what, that's why you've got to buy in with us, because we're the ones that can deliver the economies of scale to reduce that overhead. Because if you're all off on your own, then your overhead is going to be higher. But with us, we can negotiate it down. And I know that overhead is a big point of frustration for practice owners, that I often hear people describe. Everyone just wants a piece of our pie, and
Right.
the pie isn't that getting that much bigger for us, but everybody taking a slice is that it is just more and more.
I think
And
one thing
so
that
how do you
makes
see that?
I think the one thing that makes us unique is that we have a cash product. Um,
For
Unlike
how
these,
long though?
well, that's the point where, once, if it's 50-50 now, let's say it's 50% insurance contract reimbursement versus 50% cash, you're right. If eventually, if it becomes 80% insurance reimbursement, I can see more throwing in the towel and allowing equity firms to deal with economies of scale to make it easier for them. But I think the cash is what keeps the independent alive. I think, if they can just up their prices to their competitor and still do well, I think that keeps them, gives them strength to stay independent.
And so, what about someone that wants to that say, okay, uh, I'm more interested in the independent side, but I don't want to start from zero. I want to buy in with someone else, and especially because there are a lot of baby boomer docs in their early to late 60s right now that are thinking of there's I would say a quarter of the people listening to this show are probably on the fence if they want to
Right.
retire in the next 5 years or not. And then the other quarter of people in the show are people that are getting into those groups. So what should those people consider if they were to join a group like yours, let's say? Should they start off should as an associate? Is that a good place to end as well? Is that, you know what, I'm good here? Should everyone that's joining a private group try to go for a partnership eventually? What's your perspective on that?
Yeah, it's interesting. Especially for the older doctors, the older reproductive endocrinologists, they want to work 5 or 10 years, and by the way, that's where you see the equity firms come in and swoop those practices up. The senescent programs, they're ready to throw that older doctors ready to throw the towel in. They're more likely to sell to the large equity firms for sure, and it makes sense. I mean, they're in the last 5 years of their practice or 10 years, and they're not going to get what they want out of their practice typically if they sell it. So having the equity firm come in and give them some money, it's kind of a smart way to go. Your younger age docs, though, they want the ability to make more profit. They want the ability to make a better income than the average income they're seeing. Now, looking at this differently, like if you're that doctor and you have 5 or 10 years left, and I'm fortunate, I have a good experience with this. We have a lot of doctors living in Florida. We have a lot of people who want to retire here. So we have a lot of older doctors that are leaving their practices up north, and they want a part-time or a full-time job in Florida. And we've been very successful in hiring these physicians. And they've been great. We give them a strong contract. It's easy to put in some type of partnership. Absolutely. Depends on what type of partnership you're talking about. Full equity owner versus profit sharing type partnership. It just depends on what type of partnership you're discussing. But if they have 5 years left and they're not anteing in, nobody's going to sell them their practice. Richard Scott has a lot of interesting stories about this, where people would want to try to buy his practice, and when they would have, value their practices, and for them to buy in, you can't get that. Nobody can raise that kind of money to really truly become an equity owner. So it just depends on how you define the partnership. I think it's a really good opportunity for those docs. I think they still make great money. They can make great salaries and bonuses, and depends on how you structure their partnership. I think those doctors are sitting in a great position to do well before they retire. We have a gentleman that's working with us now. It's in his low 70s, and he's ready to retire, and he's done really well. I'm pretty proud of the way he structured his career. Looking back. Yeah.
What would it take for you, Sam? I'm putting myself in the position of a fellow, and I'm also thinking that when I see a lot of relationships break up, it's very often associates at the 2 to 2.5 year mark, and the associate says, "Okay, I'm ready to buy in." Partner says, "No, you're not." And whatever's happening there, I'm not in most of those conversations,
Yeah.
so I don't
Yeah.
know what's happening. But I can tell you, it's one person had one set of expectations, another party had another set of expectations, and they weren't agreed to enough. They weren't agreed upon explicitly enough, and they weren't reviewed ad nauseum. And I always tell people, I don't care if you're getting annoyed with each other in the negotiation process because you're just repeating things. Do it then, as opposed to 2 years down the line after you both have much more sunk cost. And so if I'm a someone leaving fellowship right now, and I want to move to Orlando because I've got family down there, and I'm a go-getter, Dr. Brown. I'm gonna build your practice so big, and I'm gonna see so many patients, and I want to buy into partnership. How do you sit with me and say, okay, Dr. Jones, this is how we're going to agree to it or not?
I think you approached that question, Griffin, perfectly. It's about communicating up front. And generally speaking, the fellows will come out and they will say, just like you said, "Hey, I'm going to grow this practice. I need to own part of this. I'm going to be a part of your explosive growth and success." And explaining the different partnerships was never really done to me at any practice I've ever been a part of. I think we do a fair job of it. We have a really good communicating staff here. Our administrator does a good job of explaining. I try to explain. The fellows have never been exposed to this before. They don't know business. They're not business school graduates. And when somebody owns an entity, what does that mean? Like, what this company owns, this has put millions of dollars into this practice. How is it fair for somebody coming in to how do you sell that to them? How can you let them buy into it over time? We've learned personally to be very creative about it, and we're very open-minded to all forms of partnership and ownership. But when the fellows generally see the numbers, when they actually get this education, generally by us or my administrator, they're like, "Whoa, I had no idea, Dr. Brown, that you actually had to put $4 million into that building, and somehow I got to buy. Okay, if I want to be a 50% owner, I got to buy $2 million of that $4 million building." And then you could structure that over time, over years. And one of the best groups for this is Dr. John Schnorr out of Charleston, South Carolina, is a great business mind, great reproductive endocrinology and fertility mind. They had a nice structure where it was a 7-year buy-in over time. There's ways to do these things. Is that new fellow starting a practice willing to invest over time? You can't get loans for that. Nobody's worth, you go to the bank. I was in one of my previous experiences, I was offered to become a partner. I'll be honest, I was making $300,000 a year, and they showed me the numbers in a real logical, mature sense. They said, it's going to cost you somewhere around $5 million to become in as a 50% owner. You can't get that money unless you're independently wealthy. Actually, I had a partner that went to a relative and got the money, and then tried to buy in, and it didn't work. It was just the personality of this situation. It didn't work well. The partnership wasn't structured well. But so it costs a lot of money to set up a practice. And then that fellow thinks, well, I could just start my own practice and just start from scratch. And hey, more power to you. I mean, there's non-competes, it's not like family practice. It's not like our call radius is only 20 mile radius. Our call radiuses are typically 2 to 3 hours because we're a subspecialty. So so I didn't answer your question, but all these complexities piled together.
You answered it. Just when do you have? And by the way, the phenomenon that Dr. Brown is describing is called trapped equity. There's trapped equity in the practice because the buyer can't afford what it's worth to the seller, and so you did answer the question. But when do you have that? Do you have that conversation before they even become an associate?
It's definitely as they're coming in, for sure, before they sign that original contract. Being as clear and as honest as possible, trying to explain all these situations and different possibilities. Do they want to be an equity owner? Do they want to be a profit sharing partner? There's all kinds of ways to define these partnerships. Absolutely.
What else are you looking for to qualify for partnership besides the money required to buy in? Is there a certain amount of volumes, other responsibilities taken at the office? What else should people delineate before they agree to go into partnership with each other?
Yeah, I think, just as a quick answer, I think they got to be productive. Can they? And I don't think you can know that coming in. And I think it's okay to educate them coming in, saying, hey, we're going to see how over the next 3 to 4 years, 5 years, whatever, can you produce or not? And so I don't know if buying initially coming in is the wise way to do it, because it could just lead. What's the odds that individual is truly going to be productive or not? And I've definitely learned that with hires. You have people that Julius has quoted this, there's rainmakers and there's busy bees. So, and I don't think you know what kind of doctor you are until you've been out. Like, can you really generate? Or are you really good at just being a busy bee and making it happen, what's already there? So I don't think any of us know. We all think we're going to be rainmakers when we come out of training, but are with your personality set, are you a rainmaker or are you a busy bee? And both are needed, both are necessary. But if they can't produce and they want to buy in, they can't really buy in. So
can one elucidate what a rainmaker is in numbers and key performance indicators in the beginning, so that they're not having the conversation?
Yes.
I was a rainmaker. No, you were a busy bee. Well, we have different definitions. Can that definition be established in the beginning with numbers? If you hit these, maybe it's this number of volumes, maybe it's this number of procedures, this number of new patients per week or per month.
I totally agree. And like for us, we actually we calculate that quarterly. What from the new patients coming in under that physician, what do they ultimately produce? And even if the other doctors are seeing them, that originating doctor gets credit for who came up with the treatment plan. So that's how we determine rainmakers versus busy bees. And we make it pretty clear. They know, and when they're not producing, they're on a quarterly basis, they're educated on what they've done.
And we have some episodes that fellows really stick out. We've done, I think, 100 episodes, and there's a couple that when I meet fellows, they say, I really like this episode. I really like this particular episode. I think this will be one of them. Would you be okay? Would you be okay with fellows reaching out to you if they listen?
We're a very honest, hardworking group, and we want smart-minded, strong-backed, physicians to join this entity. This entity, we hope it's going to last for 100 years. This isn't just about my tenure at Brown Fertility. This is we plan for this structure to be ongoing and not become a senescent program and be here 100 years from now. So we love strong fellows that would be interested in your educational services, and we would love to talk to them about these things.
I think that's an excellent place to conclude. Dr. Sam Brown, thank you so much for coming on Inside Reproductive Health.
Thanks, Griffin. Anytime.